The 1890s is a highly recognizable time period in contemporary society. In fact, there is an entire movement dedicated to the spirit of the time period. Don't believe me? Look at steampunk culture. However, the 1890s was quite a bit grittier than the media makes it out to be. Let's face it, we take a lot of technological and social ideas for granted, ideas which were not common in the past. This video is dedicated to understanding the history behind such ideas. Now, history is best understood with a recognition of the basic elements of the culture during the time period. The main elements that define a culture, therefore, regard fashions, technologies, music, visual arts, and social expectations. In my professional opinion, one must understand these elements in order to better comprehend the political and social changes during the time period. Memorable inventions of the 1890s include the zipper, volleyball, cotton candy, the movie projector, aspirin, hallelujah, right? The diesel engine, and the radio. However, one must remember that during the time, most of those inventions were not available to everyone. Most people still used buttons and laces, they saw plays instead of movies, they rode in buggies or on bicycles, or God forbid walked, and contacted others using telegrams and letters. The fashion during this time hinted at gradually changing social norms. For instance, although women continued to wear long skirts, wide shoulders and neckties became popular in women's attire. The fusion of men's fashions into the fashions of women would continue well into the 1920s, when boy-like physiques were considered attractive in women. Ragtime was the most popular music in the 1890s, and like any new form of music, it was considered scandalous by cultural conservatives. The most famous composer during the time was Scott Joplin, who wrote compositions like the Maple Leaf Rag. Jazz would later take its roots from ragtime, as well as the blues, another popular music genre of the 1890s. The main style of visual art during this time was post-impressionism, a slightly abstract version of realism. That about settles it for inventions and art. So how about historical events? While there were way too many events during the 1890s to explain in this video, the main cultural movements and anti-movements of the time consisted of imperialism, civil and women's rights, and progressivism. The Progressive Era, which led to books such as The Time Machine, and later The Jungle, was focused against raw capitalism and large corporations. The Progressive Era was a direct result of the earlier Industrial Revolution, in which the majority of Americans moved from rural farms to crowded, factory-based cities. These industries provided uncomfortable conditions for the workers, and the owners of these industries often worked their employees for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Workers, which included men, women, and children, received low wages and little concern was given for their health. Many business owners justified their actions through social Darwinism, which applied Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection to society. To make matters worse, many companies were bought by larger corporations, which then turned into monopolies. These monopolies were dangerous due to the lack of competition, which meant that monopolies could charge higher prices for inferior products. Thus, the 1890s kicked off with the Sherman Antitrust Act, which banned monopolistic practices. Many workers, however, remained frustrated with their working conditions. They desired a voice in the workplace. This led to the Progressive Era, which was characterized by unions, strikes, and a push for a more direct democracy. Some of the most memorable strikes during the 1890s were the Homestead Steel Strike, the Pullman Strike, and the Newsboys Strike. The Homestead Steel Strike was one of the most violent strikes in the history of America, leading to the deaths of 16 people. It was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers versus the Carnegie Steel Company. The strike was so destructive that the fighting needed to be dispersed by 8,000 militia. The Pullman strike was significant due to the unique conditions of the workers. All of the workers of the Pullman Railroad Company were required to live in the company town of Pullman. Yes, the company had its own town. The workers were actually pretty satisfied, aside from their lack of democracy. However, when the Pullman Company began laying off workers and lowering wages without lowering rent costs, the workers successfully struck. The Newsboys Strike became perhaps the most famous strike of the 1890s, thanks to the 1992 film and its theatrical adaptation, Newsies.
Will we hear it? No! What if a Delancey's come out swinging? Will we hear it? No! When you got 100 voices singing, who can hear a lousy whistle blow?
strike consisted of the New York Newsboys versus the Journal and New York World newspaper companies. The Newsboys' strike was significant because it was led by youth and children, so it was a big step in child labor rights. It ended with the Newsboys being allowed to resell papers that they were unable to sell to pedestrians. Early in the Progressive Era, the nation was slammed with an economic depression, the second largest in the history of America. This would come to be called the Panic of 1893. It occurred when the Reading Railroad went bankrupt, which caused many banks dependent on the company to collapse. Stock prices declined, and about a third of the population became unemployed. Not all controversies during the 1890s revolved strictly around economics, however. The 1890s resided in the heart of the imperialistic storm, a time when nations sought to become empires, and empires sought to engulf nations. The world fantasized of converting underdeveloped nations to Western practices and exploiting said people for wealth. However, quite a few Americans were against imperialism, arguing that it hurt foreign indigenous peoples more than it helped them. This led to books such as Heart of Darkness, a novel about imperial oppression of the Congolese. On the flip side, many advocates of imperialism wrote works, such as The White Man's Burden and The Jungle Book, in order to persuade the hesitant public of the benefits of imperialism. It was these imperialistic interests that led to US involvement in the Cuban War of Independence, in which the United States aided Cuba against Spain. While that might sound benevolent on the surface, the deeper intentions of the United States would compare better to avarice. On February 17, 1895, the USS Maine, a United States naval ship, exploded, killing 266 sailors. The United States pinned the incident as a Spanish attack, and the blame soon led to the Spanish-American War. The war did not last long, and by the end of it, the United States had acquired the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. What a fantastic win for the noble Americans, right? Well, as it turns out, we weren't so noble after all. An investigation in 1976 revealed that the explosion of the USS Maine was most likely caused internally. Many historians believe that the United States suspected the truth all along, but blamed Spain so the US could acquire its colonies. Well, joke's on us, because our stolen empire eventually led to disasters such as the Philippine-American War, US involvement in the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and much US monetary aid in the Puerto Rican financial crisis of today. While there was much controversy about the rights of foreign people during the 1890s, there was also debate about the rights of US citizens. One of the most significant events concerning people of color in the United States was the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case. This was the case that ruled the infamous separate but equal policy, a decision which would lead to legal segregation for more than 60 years. While this might appear unprogressive in our modern eyes, which in a direct sense it was, Plessy v. Ferguson in many ways revealed the progress of racial equality. This might seem like a contradiction, but prior to the 1890s, segregation was not only legal, but practically required. The fact that such an issue was even considered in court was a big step, because only 30 years prior, slavery was still common. Despite the many shameful acts of the 1890s, the time period was far from a total loss. From inventions to social progression to the grandfather of rock and roll, the 1890s proved to have some pretty awesome results. Anyway, if the 1890s never happened, there would be a gap in history. And then where would we be?
It seems we've ripped a hole in the space-time continuum.
Looks like the past is coming to us.